I'm gonna add my camera here too. Adding that to the stage. All right. And is that showing up? Hopefully it is. And back again. Add my camera here too. Adding that to the stage. All right, okay. So today I'm going to walk through a ad hoc version of what I'm up to with the software, some of the new updates that we've done. I'm going to show a couple of examples, like my capacity example. I'm going to also show something we build for render capacity, which is kind of relevant for visual effects. I'm going to talk a little bit about our AI roadmap. There's some cool stuff that I'm kind of playing with, and I'm actually looking forward to see what shows up with our new software, the new release from OpenAI. Coming up there too, I'll show some Figma designs, and I'm also going to talk about some of our pilots that are there. So here's what we've done. Whatify is taking all of the knowledge that I have from the visual effects industry, which is a very sort of node-based kind of connect the dots sort of software, and we're turning all of this into these little business logic events that you can connect together to create financial and strategic models. So think of this like your big fancy Excel spreadsheets here with all of this information, but instead we're trying to turn it into these nodes, right? If anyone's been following along, this is what the software used to look like. So this is our old version of the software there. And we're now into our full rebuild new version of the software here. All right. So let's talk about events. Okay. So imagine in your spreadsheet, you got a whole sort of tab that has a bunch of business logic in it. It's got numbers, calculations, formulas. What if you could take all of that information and instead sort of bubble them into these little individual nodes instead? So for example, I've got some things in here like a contract event or debits or expenses, incomes, these sort of things, initial balances. You've got the ability to put in customer growth and churn unit costs. So each of these has a whole bunch of metadata that's inside of it. Some of them are really, really simple. So for example, I could have something like a customer event, and when I add something like this in, I'm really just saying, here's a customer cohort, here's how many customers I have, and here's sort of a start date. Some of these are much more complex, right? So you can get into something that's more advanced, like a campaign, for example. And a campaign says, I want to take visitors to my website there, and I want to spend money on LinkedIn or Google Ads, and I want to spend a certain amount every month, and I want to see how much that cost per pay visit is going to be, and I want to keep track of that to drive more folks into my funnel. So that's kind of the idea here is you're sort of taking things that would normally be in a spreadsheet and you're trying to bring them in this sort of low code, no code type environment here, right? So what I'll kind of run through today is I'm actually going to show you my business model. So I've actually built out my business model for my application here in my own software. That's typical dog fooding 101. And I am running 27 different what if scenarios just for my software alone, right? So I'm going to show you that. I'm also going to show you some examples of how I'm using the software for capacity planning, right? And capacity can be just about anything. Capacity can be a project, and whether in my industry there's artists or whether it's workers or anything like that. How many do you need? How many have you used? How many do you have on staff? And do you need to hire or fire to kind of fill those gaps? So I'm going to show you a scenario like that. And I can also show you a scenario where I'm using it as an extension to actually calculate a render capacity. So let's take all of the projects that we have, and then let's try and figure out render capacity. Do I have enough servers? Do I need to go to the cloud in order to be able to kind of stay on track, right? So I'm going to kind of run through some basics of the software a little bit, and then I'm going to come back into some of these scenarios. I'm also going to share some of my Figma designs there. I'm also going to talk about what I'm kind of doing with OpenAI here right now and the ability to try to run what if scenarios and ask OpenAI to analyze all of this information. So imagine having a business and you literally have 27 different scenarios. That's fantastic, but that's actually too much information, right? Ultimately, when folks are building a model, they're trying to get to an answer. They're not trying to get to 27 different answers. So this actually becomes pretty daunting all at the same time. So case in point, even if I was to pop up my graph here right now, and I look at these 27 scenarios, and I graph all of them at the same time, and I'm looking at my cumulative cash flow. Like, this tells a story, but boy, that's a pretty daunting story, right? In some of these scenarios, I'm able to raise capital, and some of them it takes a bit more time, and some of these I'm back up. That's a lot of information, right? And the reality is, certain combinations of these scenarios just aren't practical. So I think there's a world where we can use OpenAI or just LLMs in general there to be able to parse through all of this data and make suggestions and recommendations on the best choices. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually just going to run through my business model here. Let's just have a little bit of fun with this one, and I'll show you how we're sort of thinking, right? So this is me. This is my company. This is a cash on hand, or I'm able to say how much money I have in the bank, right? I'm able to look at my pilots. So right now we have a couple of paid pilots that we're working on right now. I'm using an income event, for example, here to be able to say, here's my confirmed pilot income coming in from Animate, which is one of our companies there. We're helping a tech startup called Jester work on things there too. We're helping Theory Studios. They're a VR company, gaming company, animation company, build up models there. So these are actually all of my confirmed pilots, the initial pilot revenue, and then the future kind of revenue there, right? So I'm able to look at that. Oh, and of course, we got a little bug there. I'm able to look at my committed pilots here at the same time too. So these are folks that have agreed to be able to do that. I'm just going to do a refresh here and log back in. Stand by. My tokens expire every once in a while for security reasons. The way things are sort of set up. So we got to go back into my business model here, look at all of my scenarios, and I'm going to bring up my whatifi business model. Okay. Let's get back on track. So this is off calculating on AWS, and these scenarios will be back with me in a few seconds. 27 scenarios over 3 years, and we're back. All right. So next on the list here, I've got my investment. So I've raised some angel investment, so I have that in my calculations, but I'm looking at raising some additional potential angel investment. So here's one scenario where I'm able to raise more angel investment. Here's one scenario where I'm not, and instead I have to use my own capital, right? So these are two different choices. Even then, there's other sort of sub options that kind of play out. So yes, maybe I'm able to raise some short-term potential angel investment, but then I also have a longer potential raise. So what if I'm able to raise my full pre-seed, or what if I'm not? So even here already, there's like 3 different outcomes. Invest more of my own capital, raise a small angel round there to kind of get through the next couple of months, and then raise the rest of that, or I'm not able to raise the rest of that, right? So already sort of 3 different scenarios. Then I'm into my current employees. Some of those employees we've talked about having a salary increase. So I've got my legal expenses. I'm using government grants, so I have some money that's kind of coming back in, but it's also about when that kind of comes back in. Here in BC, we have this thing called the Shred tax credit here, so I get money back on some of my developer spend. I'm calculating that. I've got my operating expenses. And then what I've done in my business model is I've tried to say, okay, I have small clients, medium clients, large clients, and extra large clients. And depending on how they use the software, there's going to be a very different sort of price point for each of those. So what I've kind of gone on, and I built one version of the model where I've said, okay, what if I can add one small client every week, right? Perfect. And then in the next version here, I say, what if I can add one medium-sized client twice a month, right? And then in the next one, I'm saying, what if I add one large client a month? And in the next one, I'm saying, what if I'm able to add one extra large client every quarter, right? So now I'm able to do a scenario where I'm looking at the growth of my customers there, and obviously they're all generating revenue. But in any kind of business model, there's your plan, right? And then there's the best case version and the worst case version of that one. So here I have what's called a modifier, which is saying, well, what if my growth is actually 50% more? And what if my growth is actually 50% less, right? So again, doing this all on the fly in the same sort of model. Then I've got my customer support costs. I've got customer acquisition costs. I'm doing some monthly churn, assuming that I'm losing some customers. I've got my unit cost. So here I'm saying, well, what if the average small client is $100 a month? And what if the medium client is 250? And what if the large client is 750? And what if my extra large client is $2,500? So I'm kind of creating those price points that are there. And then I'm using a revenue event to multiply small clients times small revenue, medium clients times medium revenue, large clients times a large revenue to kind of model all of that up. I'm doing a calculation that has my setup fees. I'm assuming that for some of these clients, there's going to be initial sort of setup fee. So I'm calculating that. I'm calculating my AWS and my hosting costs as a percentage of revenue. And then I'm building my next set of what if scenarios. What if I don't hire anybody else and I just work super, super lean? What if I have my ideal hires? I would love to bring on board another backend developer. I'd love to bring on another customer success modeler. And in here, I'm able to say when they would start, how many hours they work. I can even put in salary ranges here and keep track of all these sort of folks at the same time too, right? When do I start paying myself? I've got that in the model. Because we're going down the open AI route, and I really think there's a huge AI ML play in this space as well. What if I have an AI ML team, and what if I don't? All right. And I've got a ballpark estimate that these folks are going to cost 120 grand a year. So I've got that in my model here at the same time. I'm calculating payroll tax. I'm estimating my shred tax credits. I'm starting to calculate some of my KPIs and measurements at the same time too. So this is an example of a very built out model there, and certainly there's more that I could do. But just as a reminder, that's 27 scenarios there all at the same time. The way the software works is I can click on every single one of these threads individually, and I can see each of those on their own. And I can bubble up any ledger that I want to be able to look at this model through different lenses. This is cash flow, one of the most basic, obviously. But maybe I want to go and someone wants to see, how many customers do I have? And how many customers do I have, small, medium, large, and extra large in all these different scenarios? So this is my total customer count, but I can look at all 27 here and I can see the three different versions of my customer model: baseline growth, aggressive growth, slow growth, and I can see what that looks like over time, right? Or I can keep track of just my small clients. So maybe I want to be able to see a ratio of small clients. I'm just going to isolate just one scenario. So say in this scenario here are my small clients, my large clients, my extra large clients, and my medium clients. So here now I'm kind of getting a spread. I can start to see the shape of this business. And what you're noticing here, these are the different cadences or frequencies with which we add customers to the model. So because I'm adding small clients every week, every few months, there's that extra month, you're seeing these spikes. So you're able to sort of see that play out over time, and we can look at this cumulatively over time to sort of see the spread of customers that I have in my model, right? And again, I can do that across all the different lenses there. Other thing you can do in the model is you can start to lock things in, right? So say we're rocking along, and at some given stage, let's just assume that this potential angel investment actually plays out, right? So if that actually happens, then it negates this other scenario. So I can click on this and I can lock this scenario, right? This particular thread. And if I recalculate my simulation, it will go through and it will now only run that one particular branch. It's going to ignore the other branch. And my 27 outcomes are going to simplify here dramatically. And now I'm down to 18 different outcomes, right, that are kind of going through. Likewise, I could say, what if I get really lucky here? What if I tell a good story and I'm able to close out my entire pre-seed? Well, now I can actually lock in this particular scenario and recalculate that now. And I'm going from 18 outcomes now down to some other number. I'm going down to 9 outcomes that are there. Right? So it's a way of sort of building out these kind of complex what ifs. But then as either you make a decision or things kind of lock in, you have the ability to, without deleting anything, toggle on these different scenarios in real time, right? We could also do things too that I can bypass or remove things on the fly. So imagine having your big fancy spreadsheets and you're trying to take something out or put something back in. You're either deleting a number or putting it back in, or you're kind of creating some fancy toggle or something to either include something or exclude something. Here, I could sort of take out of this particular scenario, if I temporarily wanted to take my salary out of that, I can bypass an event temporarily and I can recalculate, and it just takes that calculation out of the model on the fly. Right. So now that's not calculating, it's not part of it. I haven't deleted it, I've just temporarily removed it and bypassed it from the model. And then I can turn that back on really easy and kind of get that back up and running. Okay. So this, just like Excel, it can be used for simple things. It can be used for complex things and even more complex things. For anyone who's kind of joining, this is my financial model for my company where I'm running a bunch of different scenarios on my fundraising, how quickly I can grow customers, how much I charge, who I hire to be able to kind of build out these models. I'm going to pop over here briefly to see if there's any questions. I don't see any. I also can't tell if I'm actually missing the opportunity to see those questions. So I'm just going to keep rocking along, and you're welcome to try and ask those questions, and I'll see if I can figure out how to kind of get to those. Okay. So the next one I want to show you, I want to show you a really basic capacity scenario here too. This is one of the areas that I really focused on in having spent years and years and years in the visual effects industry. I know how hard it is to look at many different projects, many different resources, many different sort of projections and when you need those resources and whether you should be hiring, firing, laying off, all these sort of things. So this is super simple, just to be kind of clear. But in this scenario, I'm running two models. I'm looking at how many employees do I have? I'm looking at the projects that I have. I'm looking at the resources I need to complete this project. I'm looking at the resources I've used to date so far to do that project. And then I'm doing capacity calculations to saying what are my over and what are my unders. Okay. So an employee event. In an employee event, I can say, I can put in specific people like Bill and Sue, or I can be very general and say, I've got 5 artists. They start June 1st here. I could put in financial data if I wanted to. I can also say I've got contractors. So I've got one contractor who's working 35 hours a week. They start on this date, they work to this date. So that gives me the ability, I'm gonna have to refresh that one again. Let's see if this kind of works here. Uh, refresh. And the dev team's doing a couple updates behind the scenes. So get this back up and running. So let me get my capacity one back up here. Is it this one? Yeah. Okay. So here I can look at my employees, right? So I can look at what do I got, right? So if I look at my resources, which are employees, and I look at my artists right now, this is what I've got available to me. I've got 5 artists available here. Then I've got my contractor kicking in. I've got 6 artists available here. And then I'm back down to 5. And this can be sort of broken down into sublayers. So you can certainly talk about roofers and plumbers and electricians. You can talk about compositors and animators. Anything can be broken down into these sort of sublevels. Then I got a project. Project AAA. Really simple, but it's a bucket. We can even put dollars and cents in here and how much the project is worth. I haven't done it in sort of simple example. Then let's talk about what do we need, right? Well, in this particular example right now, right, I need artists and I need 1,000 hours worth of artists starting on July 1st and going till the end of the year, right? Now, what would normally happen in most sort of projections is you would sort of put that 1,000 hours on a timeline and it would spread out and you'd have the average number of artists that you need over that period of time. We have a pretty cool thing in here that I call distributions. So it's the ability to take those 1,000 hours, take that start date, take that end date, and instead I'm going to kind of apply a distribution to this, right? So in the distribution, the reality is no resource ever just sort of starts out. You're going to ramp up into a resource or you're going to ramp down, or there's going to be some big sort of milestones along the way there. This is what's really going to happen with that 1,000 hours, right? So I give you the ability to kind of create this distribution, and then we can sort of save that distribution and we can update that. And this is the reality on what we're going to need, right? So my resources needed, now this is in hours here, now actually looks something more like this, right? We're redistributing that full 1,000 hours, right? I'm looking at the cumulative value here, but instead we're looking at what it's really going to look like there over time. Okay, cool. Actually, I need to recalculate that one because I changed that distribution. Yeah, so there's that revised distribution that's there right now. Sweet. But we're into the project right now. Here we are in middle of September right now. We've been into this project. What have we actually used up so far? This may have been our plan, but what actually happened? And the reality is we've used up 500 hours. I ran this sort of simulation on the 4th here, but we've used up 500 hours of that so far. So let's take a look at that. And so resources used are 5,000, which means we now want to take what do we need minus what have we used? What is the new adjusted resources? Okay. So this resources adjusted is kind of the new plan, right? So I actually need, I don't remember which one's which. I actually need less, right, up front here because I've actually used up more of the resources than I had planned at the beginning of the schedule. So now I actually need less for the remainder of the project there. So we're rebalancing the resources as we go there along the way. All right. And really, what are we trying to decide? We're trying to decide not hours, but we're trying to decide people. Do we have the people that we need to be able to deliver this project on time? Whether you're building a house, whether you're trying to complete a shot on a movie, whatever it is, that's sort of the capacity piece, right? So we have these events called a capacity event. And really what it's doing is it's setting some parameters. I want to know how many people I am over or under in any given role, right? And I want to assume that I'm staffing to 100% of my need, and I want to assume that I'm working 5 days a week, right? But in reality, you can also start to kind of bend the curve here. What if instead I staffed 80% of my need? What if we're going to work 6-day weeks and instead solve this with overtime, right? So the capacity calculation now goes through and actually says, I'm going to do this instead. I'm going to show my resources and my capacity. Resources is what do I got, right? And then capacity is what do I need, right? And now we can kind of see where we are over or under in our capacity there at that particular sort of stage. And we can kind of compare that in both scenarios. So let me just kind of look at capacity. So in both these scenarios, right, it was a very simple project. I actually have unused resources here right now, right? And once the project is over, I'm going to have 5 people without actual work to do, right? So that's kind of the idea there is you're able to look at what do you got, what do you need, what have you used, and what's the differential between those two, right? Hopefully that makes sense there. So if I'm taking that, I can then go and expand upon that one. So I'm going to show you a really basic render capacity scenario that we put together as well. Render capacity is in visual effects, and there are parallels in other industry. Here's a project. What am I going to need, whether it's calculation CPU time or GPU time here to actually be able to complete that project? So I'm going to pull up another one. This is a proof of concept, but this is my, let me find my render capacity one here. Stand by. I have it loaded up there. Render projections. Okay. So we're going to take that same sort of logic that we just had, but I'm going to take it to a bit of a different level here. So in this model, concept here is depending on the type of artist in a studio, they're going to have different render needs. An effects artist is going to use proportionately a lot more horsepower than a layout artist is going to be. So in this one, we have the concept of what's called a render unit. Okay. So in this one, I'm going to use 3 examples here. We have animators, and we're going to assume that the average animator uses 50 render units, right? Whereas an effects artist is going to use 40 render units, and a comper is going to use 175 render units. Think of it like electricity or whatever it is. It's like how much resources are they going to draw, right? We're trying to figure out what that is on average there, and then we can use that to kind of map out the show. So again, back to projects. Here we got 2 projects. We've got project A and we've got project B in here, right? And I'm using the same project resources as before. And again, this is hours right now. So this is still like the same types of thing. I know that I'm going to need animators on this project. I know that I'm going to need effects artists on this project. And I know that I'm going to need compers on this project. I know that I'm going to need 460 hours of animation. I know that I need 600 hours of effects. I know that I need 1,000 hours of compositing, right? So I'm kind of laying out what I need. But I'm also using that distribution again. So I am saying this is my distribution of animation. So it's not just what I need, but when I'm going to need it. And if we're thinking about that render usage, it's going to be proportional to this. There's certainly a bunch of yeah buts on there, so we can kind of get into what some of those are, but that's the idea that it's going to be kind of proportional. Or if I'm looking at my effects here over the duration, effects is going to be busy and then they're going to slow down. And if I look at my compositing, for example, compositing is almost always going to be sort of weighted towards the end of the show. So that's what we're able to do with our distribution. So back to that, I can sort of pop up this model and I can look at, starting with my people resources, what do I need for project A? And I've also got a project B in here, right? And I can see that need. And this is the need. And if we need to, we can drill down inside those resources needed and look at the specific departments at the same time too. Project A animators, effects, and compositors. So I'm putting all of that onto the graph here. So this is what I need for animation, this is what I need for effects, and this is what I need for projects. All right, cool. I've got project A here existing. I've got a scenario where there is no project B, so I'll kind of come back to that one, but I'm able to sort of see what those resources look like. I am looking at my render units available, right? So here I'm saying that every single day, I've got my main render farm, and I've got 400 render units of capacity every single day. Cool. And I'm also kind of going in and say, well, I've got my workstations, right? So I'm also saying that there are, on average, there's 100 units of rendering available on those workstations. But, and this is kind of getting a little deeper into the thing, we have our weekends. So maybe on Saturday and Sunday, we're going to increase that to 350 and another 350 and then another 350. What we're trying to set up here is our render unit capacity, right? So let me kind of pop that one up here really quickly. And this is my capacity. This is what I've got, right? Let me pop another one here too. Render units available, sorry, that's the one that I want. So render units available, all right? So here's what we got. This is what we have available to the facility here over time. So now I can just do some simple math where I'm multiplying the artist's time, the resource needs, times what all of that is to be able to calculate my render capacity overall. So I'm able to sit here and say in this version of the scenario, right, I've got plenty of need there in the one scenario, right? In another scenario, I've got extra need. So I'm able to kind of look at these two scenarios and say, do I have enough render resources or do I not have enough render resources to be able to deliver this project on time? So that's the idea with capacity stuff. Yeah. And I'm not sure if I'm able to see questions here. I don't think I can, so I'm just gonna keep going. I'm probably gonna go for like another sort of 7 minutes or so, and then I'm gonna wrap things up. I see some folks are dropping off there too, so I'm gonna jump back over to our model here, right? So I'm gonna show you really quickly how easy it is to build something in the software, right? So I'm going to create a new scenario here very quickly, and this is going to be, screen test here. I'm going to set a date for this one, which is the beginning of this month, and I'm going to add this in. Right? And I'm going to have to refresh this one again. We've got a couple of token errors here. 1 second. Get that back up and running. And we should be back in 1 second here. There we go. So I'm going to create a new scenario, and I'm going to call it stream test. All right, and I'm going to set up the date of this one to be the beginning of this month. It's a 1-year scenario. Okay, so I've got my root node here. No calculations running at this particular stage. Let's add an income in, for example. So I'm going to add an income in, and I'm going to say we've got this is income A. Frequency is monthly. Let's say this is $10,000, and the start date is November the 1st. All right. So if I add this in, I can drop this into the model. I can calculate, and in a second or two, I now have my $10,000 a month. And if I want to, I can look at that as income here at the same time too. Right. So there's my income. Great. I can also double click on this one, and I can add another income stream if I want to. So let's call this income B. Okay, income B might be a one-time income. We're going to call this like 45,000 bucks, and this is something that happens on the 16th of January. So now when I drop this in, I'm now seeing those two combined incomes on the fly there at the same time. Right? So step one. Now maybe I have some expenses, so I can drop an expense in here if I want to, and I can say this is expense A. And here I can say this is monthly, but if I want to, I can set a start date and end date. I can amortize this one. So let's do this instead. I'm going to say this is a $50,000 expense. It is something that is going to start in February, and it's going to run for 5 months. So we'll automatically kind of create the amortization there for you. We're automatically putting that into expenses. For the accountants in the room, we can also kind of decide where we actually want to put that money. So I could put under my operating expenses if I want to, and I can drop this in and run my calculations. And now I've got my monthly cash flow, right? I have my income, and if I want to, I can also bubble up my expenses at the same time. So I'm able to see all of these things live. Here's my income, here are my expenses. I'm seeing them both at the same time, or my cash flow. I can look at this monthly or cumulatively to understand, what the business kind of looks like. Right. So that's sort of the beginning of things. But now we can maybe make one of our sort of first decisions on things. All right. So anytime you want to have an option one or an option two, you have to drop in a decision event. Okay. So we're going to drop in a decision here. Okay. And this can be anything. I'm going to add another, let's say employee, right? So maybe I'm going to hire Bill, right? So I'm looking at hiring Bill. Bill is going to be, I'm going to create what's called a ledger here. So I'm going to say this is a developer, for example. So I'm creating a role type here, right? Dev, and I'm creating a place to store this information. So I now have Bill, who's a developer. Bill can work 40 hours a week. Bill is going to start December the 17th there, and we're going to give Bill a salary. Bill is making 120,000 bucks a year. He's getting paid monthly, and that calculation for Bill is we're going to put into our operating expenses. Okay. So I've just kind of created essentially a transaction there for Bill, and I'm dropping him in here. Keep in mind, I'm not just financial data, I'm also regular information as well. So we can certainly look at how much we're spending on operating expenses for Bill, right? So I can see Bill here right now, and I can see the cost to kind of bring Bill on board, although I think I've got some other calculations in there as well. I'm going to actually, on the fly, I'm going to go a little deeper down my operating expenses, and I'm going to put that as an employee expense. Recalculate. So now we're going to be able to see, I know there's a lot of clicking here, but now we're looking at our employment expenses. And now I'm seeing Bill's $10,000 a month, amortized $120,000 there. Cool. There's Bill, right? But what if I'm looking at potentially hiring Sue instead, right? I can copy Bill, and I can paste him over here, drop this in, right? And let's call this Sue instead. And give this a name, which is Sue here. And Sue instead can't start until the new year. And Sue is $145,000 instead there. But Sue can only work 35 hours a week, right? So now I have those two in there at the same time. Recalculate, and now I have two models here, right? Pop up my threads. I have two different versions of the future here, and I can see what my cash flow looks like cumulatively in both of those models there on the fly, right? So that's really how you start to kind of build scenarios. There's a lot more to it, but that's the idea of being able to build scenarios. I'm going to show you one other big sort of power move in the software there. So it's really common to be in a meeting and someone says, well, what if we do this? Or what if we do that, right? So say someone was to come in and say, well, what if instead of spending $50,000 on our server costs, what if instead we, make that 25,000 instead, right? One way is you take this and you copy and paste it and you kind of create a branch and you make it 25,000 in one and you make it 50,000 in the other. That's one way of approaching this, right? The other way of approaching this is we can use what's called a modifier, right? And it's almost like an afterthought. So my afterthought in this particular scenario is I want to add in a modifier here. And I want to say in just this one version of the future, right? We're going to call this 25K. What if in this version, we take a look at an expense event upstream, specifically the one that we kind of put in there, and we specifically look at expense A right now, which is currently $50,000, right? And what if in just this one version of the future, we change that value to be 25,000 instead, right? And I say fill an ad, right? And what that's going to do is it is overriding this value in here in just that one slice, okay? So now when I run this particular scenario, one version has that at 25K, one version has 50K, and I'm not actually changing the initial value or turning things on and off. I'm able to just sort of do all of this dynamically on the fly, right? So that's what we kind of got there. With the tiny bit of time remaining, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you kind of what we're up to on things. OpenAI, right? So all of this information, we have it in graphs, we have it in tables and charts that are in here. You can look at all this information and you can open this up and you can see both monthly and cumulatively what these values are. That's a lot of information. And the challenge now becomes, well, what do I do with all of that? Especially when they get big and complicated, like some of the models that I showed you for my own sort of business model there for anyone who was here at the beginning of things. So you end up kind of getting these massive exports of data. Okay. So this is a real customer of mine there right now. We have, what do we have? We have 280 rows of data. Oh, there's a couple of blanks in here right now. That's a massive amount of information to parse. And that is just for one scenario alone. I know for this particular client, when we have all of their scenarios on, there's actually 1,200 different outcomes, right? So what we're testing right now is the ability to use OpenAI and getting it to understand the architecture of how we build these models, the nesting of these models, and the step-by-steps of these models there. And these are all early tests right now, but I'm using that to be able to sort of pull into a test with ChatGPT-4, and hopefully sometime soon we'll be able to kind of play with the advanced reasoning in here too, and being able to ask of the model information that's contained inside of it, right? So while you can pop up all the graphs, you can look for all these things. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do, and this is an example of our old software, is we want to be able to have an ask whatifi type option inside the software. I want to be able to say, hey, whatifi, how many customers do I have by the end of 2025 in scenario one or scenario two, right? And we've already been able to test and prove that out. That's actually really easy to be able to run through and just be able to grab something like the total customers by the end of a particular period, 138,000 or something like this. Right? Want to be able to kind of run through and say, what are my total cost of goods sold or my total revenue? And once you're able to do that, you're also able to kind of get OpenAI to run calculations for you on the fly. It's calculating my gross profit margin here in real time there by that particular sort of stage. So that's really where I want to head with the software longer term is no one really wants 27 different scenarios. They want to be able to zone in on what the best scenario is and why. And that's where we're going to be heading with our OpenAI integration phase one, right? Phase two in that is being able to actually build these models dynamically, right? So what we've been able to do as a proof of concept is to train OpenAI on what each of these events actually are and what's actually needed for them to calculate, right? So to be able to define what is a customer, what's required, what information needs to be inside of that, or what is an employee or what is an income there, so that you can then use a conversational experience there to say, what if I open up a lemonade stand in Vancouver next summer? And instead of you having to go through and fill in all these numbers or go and research what some of these numbers are, instead you can use that domain knowledge instead to fill in some of these blanks. It can tell you how much lemons are in Vancouver or what next summer is, and automatically fill in some of those dates there as well. I don't have a good proof of concept here that I can kind of show. It's much slower right now, but we've already got the ability to create some of these nodes that are on the fly. Last thing on the roadmap, it's really a design exercise right now. So I'm sure anyone who's looking at this is like, okay, it seems potentially powerful, but also pretty confusing. And there's just a lot of stuff kind of going on there. Back to my point, here is our business model. And I'm sure this would be daunting for anybody who's looking at that at first blush, right? So we're really spending a bunch of time starting to kind of work on some of our designs in the software. So this is my Figma mockups here right now. and the ability to break this data apart in more useful ways, a bit of a dashboarding type of function. So on the left side here, you might have all of your drivers and inputs, your customer list, your pricing, your employees. And then on the right side here is where you start to actually model out scenario one, scenario two, scenario three. So you can very easily see what's real and what's possible right now and sort of separate those two, right? So we're working towards that. The other thing we're working towards are a lot more sort of dashboard type of cards here too. So it's the ability to not only have the model, not only have the graph, but also to be able to cherry pick any value or any property or any calculation and just sort of pull it out and sort of separate it here too. So you can really just extract only the data you need at any kind of given moment in time there at the same time too. Um, just making it more digestible and easier to kind of reach. So anyway, that's the basics for today. In summary, what we did is kind of ran through some of our future sort of designs for the software. We also went through a couple of business models where I can show a really complicated use case. We very quickly built a model on the fly. I talked about some of our capacity calculations and how we're running some of those there. Talked about render capacity calculations as well, and just the roadmap for the software. So that's it. Again, this was impromptu. Happy to answer any kind of questions offline if anyone has any questions. All right. I am going to shut down the stream. Thanks, everyone.